The lecture hall buzzed with quiet chatter as students from across the galaxy settled into their seats. Professor Zeltak adjusted his 6 arms, each one holding a different data pad as he prepared for today's lesson. His compound eyes swept across the room, taking in the diverse collection of beings that made up his xenobiology class. There were the tall, graceful Etherians with their translucent blue skin that seemed to glow from within. A group of Corvin students clustered together, their rocky, crystalline bodies clicking softly as they communicated through vibrations. Near the front, several Vorthian students like himself sat with perfect posture, their multiple arms taking detailed notes. And in the back corner, almost hidden from view, sat the 3 humans. Professor Zeltak had been teaching at Galactic University for over 40 years, but humans were still a rare sight in his classroom. Most species sent hundreds, sometimes thousands of students to learn at the prestigious institution. The humans sent 3. He cleared his throat, a sound that came out as a melodic hum through his vocal cords. The room fell silent. Today we discuss one of the most fascinating aspects of galactic biology, Professor Zeltak began, his voice carrying easily through the large hall. Extinction patterns and species survival rates across known civilizations. He activated the holographic display above his desk. Charts and graphs appeared in the air, showing data collected from thousands of worlds over millions of years. As you can see, he continued, pointing with one of his arms while the others manipulated the display, extinction events are remarkably rare in our galaxy. When they do occur, they typically affect only 15 to 30% of a species before adaptation mechanisms take hold. A young Etherian raised her hand. Professor, what about natural disasters? Asteroid impacts, solar flares, planetary cooling? Excellent question, Lyra. Professor Zeltak smiled, his facial features shifting in the way his species expressed pleasure. Natural disasters do cause temporary population drops, but life finds a way. Species adapt, evolve, or migrate. The data shows us that complete extinction is almost impossible once a civilization reaches spacefaring capability. He changed the display to show survival curves. Each line represented a different species, and nearly all of them showed the same pattern. A sharp dip during crisis periods, followed by recovery and growth. The Corvin faced the Great Ice Age on their homeworld 3,000 years ago, he explained. Their population dropped by 28%. Today they thrive across 47 systems. The Delani survived the plasma storms that destroyed their original colonies. The Vorthian Empire weathered 3 different plague outbreaks that each claimed millions of lives. Professor Zeltak gestured broadly with all 6 arms. In every case, the species survived, adapted, and grew stronger. This is the natural order of things. Extinction is rare because life is remarkably resilient. A student near the middle raised a tentacle. What about species that just disappear? Surely some civilizations have been completely wiped out. The archaeological record suggests otherwise, Professor Zeltak replied. We find evidence of migration, of populations moving to new worlds or adapting to new environments. Even when we discover dead worlds, we usually find that the inhabitants simply moved on to better locations. He paused to let this sink in. Around the room, students nodded or made their species-equivalent gestures of understanding. The data was clear, the patterns obvious. Extinction was a statistical anomaly, not a real threat to advanced civilizations. In the back of the room, one of the humans shifted in his seat. Professor Zeltak noticed, because the movement was different from the others, where his other students sat with the confidence of species that had never truly faced existential threat. This human seemed tense. The human was young by their standards, probably in his early 20s, but his face carried lines that spoke of experiences beyond his years. His brown hair was cut short in military fashion, and his green eyes held a depth that made Professor Zeltak slightly uncomfortable. Are there any questions before we move on to adaptation strategies? The professor asked. The human in the back raised his hand slowly. Yes, Cadet Miller? Jake Miller stood up, and Professor Zeltak noticed how the other students turned to look at him. Humans were already unusual enough in the classroom, but something about this one's presence commanded attention. Professor, Jake said, his voice steady but carrying an undertone that made the room go quiet. What if I told you that 99% of my species is gone? Professor Zeltak blinked his compound eyes, certain he had misheard. The translator devices sometimes malfunctioned, especially with the more primitive technology that humans used. I'm sorry, Cadet Miller. Could you repeat that? I believe there was a translation error. Jake stepped into the aisle and Professor Zeltak could see him more clearly now. The young human's hands bore scars, old burn marks that spoke of violence. His uniform was Regulation Galactic University issue, but underneath it the professor could see the outline of more scars. No translation error, Professor, Jake said quietly. 99% of humanity is dead. Of the 8 billion people who lived on Earth just 50 years ago, fewer than 80 million are still alive. The silence in the room was complete now. Even the Corvin had stopped their subsonic communication. Professor Zeltak felt his confidence in his data wavering for the first time in decades. That's not possible, he stammered. The statistical models clearly show that species survival rates never drop below 70%, even in the most catastrophic scenarios. Your species has space travel, established colonies, technological advancement. According to every model we have, humans should have survival rates consistent with other civilizations. Jake's expression didn't change. If anything, he looked tired, as if he had been carrying a weight for so long that it had become part of him. Your models assume that a species has time to adapt, Jake said. They assume that extinction events happen slowly, that there are warning signs, that populations can migrate or evolve or find ways to survive. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried clearly through the silent hall. We didn't have time. Professor Zeltak found himself leaning forward, his 6 arms unconsciously reaching toward the human as if trying to grasp the impossible data he was presenting. What happened to your species, Cadet Miller? Jake looked around the room at the faces staring at him. Etherians glowing with curiosity, Corvin crystals pulsing with interest, Vorthian students with their multiple eyes focused intently on him, all of them representatives of species that had survived every challenge their worlds had thrown at them. We met something that doesn't appear in your data, Professor, Jake said. We met something that doesn't care about adaptation or evolution or the natural resilience of life. He sat back down, but the weight of his words hung in the air like a physical presence. We met the Devourers. The word Devourers hung in the air like a curse. Professor Zeltak had heard whispers of such beings in the darkest corners of galactic folklore, but he had always dismissed them as myths told by primitive species to explain natural disasters they couldn't understand. Cadet Miller, he said carefully, perhaps you could elaborate on what you mean by Devourers? Jake remained seated, but his posture was that of a soldier giving a report. The other students leaned forward, drawn in despite themselves by the gravity in his voice. 53 years ago, our deep space monitoring stations detected something moving through the outer edges of human space, Jake began. At first, our scientists thought it was a natural phenomenon. The readings didn't match anything in our databases. No heat signatures, no electromagnetic emissions, no radiation patterns that made sense. He paused, his hands gripping the edge of his desk. Professor Zeltak noticed the scars on his knuckles were perfectly parallel, as if something with claws had raked across them. The first colony to go silent was New Geneva, a mining operation on the edge of the Centauri system, home to about 2 million people. When we lost contact, we assumed it was equipment failure. Solar storms were common in that region. Jake's voice remained steady, but Professor Zeltak could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened slightly. 3 days later, we lost contact with the entire Proxima system. 4 colonies, 12 million people. Then the Tau Ceti outposts went dark. Then Kepler 452. Then Wolf 359. A Corvin student, her crystalline body pulsing with nervous energy, spoke up. Equipment failures can cascade through connected systems. Perhaps it was a technological plague, some kind of virus in your communication networks. Jake turned to look at her and she stepped back involuntarily at the expression in his eyes. That's what we thought too, until the Starship Endeavour made it back to Earth. Professor Zeltak found himself holding his breath. Around the room, students from species that had never known true fear were learning what it felt like. The Endeavour was a deep space research vessel that had been studying gas giant formations in the Proxima system when the colonies went dark. Captain Rodriguez managed to keep his ship hidden in the rings of Proxima B while he watched what happened to the colonies below. Jake stood up again, and this time he walked to the center of the room. Professor Zeltak noticed that he moved like someone who had been in combat, always aware of his surroundings. never turning his back completely to any group of people. What Captain Rodriguez saw didn't match any threat assessment in human military doctrine. The Devourers weren't ships in any sense we understood. They were structures, geometric patterns of dark metal that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. They moved without any visible propulsion, and they were massive. Some of them were larger than our biggest cities. An Etherian student, her blue skin flickering with distress, asked, "How did they attack? Plasma weapons? Kinetic bombardment? Biological warfare?" "They didn't attack," Jake replied. And the simplicity of his statement was somehow more terrifying than any description of weapons could have been. They consumed. He walked over to the holographic display that still showed Professor Zelthak's charts of species survival rates. With a gesture that seemed almost gentle, he reached through the light projections, scattering the data into meaningless fragments. The Devourers landed on colony worlds and simply ate them. Not just the people, not just the buildings, everything, the atmosphere, the oceans, the rock, the core metals. They broke down matter at the molecular level and absorbed it into their structures. Within hours, planets that had supported millions of people became empty voids of space. Professor Zelthak's multiple arms trembled as he tried to process this information. That violates several fundamental laws of physics. Mass conservation, energy requirements, thermodynamic principles. "Yeah," Jake said with a bitter smile. "We said the same thing, right up until they reached Earth." The silence in the room was different now. Before, it had been the quiet of focused attention. Now it was the silence of beings confronting something beyond their understanding. Captain Rodriguez managed to get word back to Earth. Our entire military mobilized. Every ship, every weapon, every defensive system we had. We evacuated as many civilians as we could to the outer colonies, but there wasn't time to move 8 billion people. Jake walked back to his seat, but he didn't sit down. Instead, he stood behind his chair, gripping the back of it like an anchor. The battle for Earth lasted 6 hours. Our most advanced warships, weapons that could crack continents, shields that could withstand stellar radiation. None of it mattered. The Devourers didn't fight us. They ignored us. Our weapons passed through them like they weren't there, and they just kept consuming. Professor Zelthak found his voice. "How did anyone survive?" "Because humans are stubborn," Jake said. And for the first time since he'd started speaking, there was something other than grief in his voice. "Because when faced with impossible odds, we don't give up. We adapt." He finally sat down, but his eyes remained fixed on the professor. Admiral Carter, commander of Earth's defense fleet, realized that conventional combat was useless, so she ordered a full evacuation protocol. Every ship that could carry people, from military vessels to cargo haulers to private yachts, was loaded with survivors and sent in different directions across the galaxy. Jake's voice softened slightly. "My parents put me on a civilian transport when I was 12 years old. I watched through the viewport as the Devourers reached Earth's surface. I watched my world become a cloud of cosmic dust in the space of an afternoon." A Vorthian student near the front, her 6 arms wrapped around herself in distress, asked, "Where did the survivors go?" "Everywhere and nowhere," Jake replied. The evacuation was chaos. Ships scattered across hundreds of systems, most without proper navigation data or sufficient supplies. Some groups found habitable worlds and tried to rebuild. Others just disappeared into the void. He looked around the room at the faces staring at him, these beings from species that had never faced existential threat. Over the next decade, the Devourers systematically consumed every human colony they could find. They seemed to track our technology signatures, our electromagnetic emissions. Any group that tried to rebuild, to restart civilization, to send out distress signals, they found them. Professor Zelthak's datapad slipped from his nerveless fingers. "How many survived?" "We don't know exactly. The last census we managed was 20 years ago, and it counted about 78 million humans scattered across the galaxy. Hidden populations on mining worlds, research stations in dead systems, nomadic fleets that never stay in one place long enough to be detected." Jake stood up one final time, and Professor Zelthak could see the weight of his species' history in the young man's posture. "You say extinction is rare, Professor. Maybe it is for species that face normal threats, plagues, natural disasters, wars with other civilizations. But we didn't face a normal threat. We faced something that treats entire civilizations like food." He picked up his datapad and headed toward the door. The other students watched him go in complete silence. At the threshold, he turned back. Your statistics assume that life wants to survive, Jake said quietly. They don't account for things that want life to die. The door closed behind him with a soft hiss, leaving Professor Zelthak alone with his shattered certainties and a room full of students who had just learned that the galaxy was far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. 3 days after Jake Miller's testimony shattered Professor Zelthak's understanding of galactic survival patterns, the academic found himself unable to concentrate on anything else. He had canceled his remaining lectures and spent every waking moment researching, trying to find some evidence that would contradict the human's impossible story. He found none. What he did find, buried in classified military reports and restricted xenoarchaeological surveys, were references to dark zones, regions of space where advanced civilizations had simply vanished without explanation. Systems where planets showed signs of having supported complex life, but where nothing remained except empty orbits and cosmic dust. Professor Zelthak was reviewing sensor data from the former Altair system when his communication device chimed. The caller ID showed Cadet Miller's student identification. Professor, Jake's voice came through the speaker. I heard you've been asking questions about the Devourers. Yeah, Zelthak admitted. I've been trying to verify your claims. I'm afraid I owe you an apology, Cadet Miller. The evidence supports everything you told us. There was a pause before Jake responded. Would you like to meet some of the other survivors? 2 hours later, Professor Zelthak found himself in the cargo bay of a modified transport ship docked at the university's spaceport. The vessel looked like any other civilian cargo hauler from the outside, but as Jake led him through the interior, the professor noticed subtle modifications. Shielded compartments, redundant life support systems, and what appeared to be military-grade sensor dampening equipment. Welcome to the Wanderer, Jake said as they entered the ship's main hold, home to about 300 humans and currently serving as transport for a very special meeting. The cargo bay had been converted into a conference room. Representatives from what Jake explained were several different human survivor groups sat around a large table made from repurposed shipping containers. Professor Zelthak's 6 arms trembled as he took in the faces around him. There was Commander Lisa Rodriguez, a woman in her 50s, whose intense brown eyes seemed to catalog every detail of the room. She led the underground cities on Kepler 442b, where 12,000 humans had carved out a life beneath the planet's surface. Dr. Alan Foster, a thin man with prematurely gray hair, represented the forest communities on Endara. His people had allied with the native Silvani, tree-like beings who helped camouflage human settlements within their vast woodland cities. Captain Nina Chen commanded the Void Fleet, 30,000 humans who lived permanently in space, moving constantly between systems in converted cargo ships and mining vessels. And there were others. Representatives from hidden colonies, nomadic tribes, research stations tucked away in the dead systems where no one else wanted to go. Professor Zelthak, Commander Rodriguez said, standing to greet him. Jake tells us you're trying to understand what happened to humanity. I'm trying to understand how it's possible that an advanced species could face such catastrophic population loss, the professor replied honestly. Your survival strategies appear to be remarkably sophisticated. Dr. Foster smiled sadly. 50 years of running from an enemy that can track technology signatures teaches you to be creative. We've had to abandon almost everything that made us recognizably human in terms of civilization. He activated a holographic display that showed the Endara colony. Professor Zelthak saw what appeared to be a natural forest, but as the image zoomed in, he could make out carefully concealed structures built into and around the massive trees. We don't use metal construction materials anymore, Dr. Foster explained. No electromagnetic emissions above background levels. No large-scale manufacturing. We grow our homes rather than build them, using modified Silvani bioengineering techniques. Captain Chen leaned forward. The Void Fleet has gone even further. We've eliminated permanent settlements entirely. Our largest ships house about 5,000 people each, but we never stay in one system for more than a few weeks. We've become nomads. Professor Zelthak studied the data they were showing him. But this represents an enormous regression in technological capability. You've essentially abandoned industrial civilization. We've adapted, Commander Rodriguez said firmly. The underground cities on Kepler 442b use geothermal power exclusively. No fusion reactors, No antimatter systems, nothing that produces the energy signatures the devourers seem to track. We mine by hand, manufacture using techniques that would have been considered primitive on Earth 50 years ago. She paused, and her expression hardened. But we're alive. Jake activated another display, this one showing a map of the galaxy with tiny dots scattered across it. These are the confirmed human populations we know about. 63 separate groups ranging from a few hundred people to our largest settlement of 15,000 on Kepler, 442b. Professor Zeltak counted the dots. That's barely 80,000 people. 87,432 as of our last census, Dr. Foster corrected, including 17 children born in the last standard year. The pride in his voice when he mentioned the children made Professor Zeltak's hearts ache. He was beginning to understand the true scope of what had happened to humanity. How do you coordinate between such scattered populations? He asked. Captain Chen smiled for the first time since he'd arrived. Very carefully. We use a communication network based on pre-digital technology, physical message drops, coded transmissions using background radiation patterns, sometimes just word of mouth carried by traders and travelers. It takes months for messages to travel between distant groups, Commander Rodriguez added. But it works, and more importantly, it doesn't produce the kind of organized communication signatures that the devourers seem able to track. Professor Zeltak was quiet for several minutes, processing what he was learning. These humans had essentially recreated their entire civilization from scratch, optimized for survival rather than growth or technological advancement. There's something else you should know, Jake said quietly. We're not the only ones, the professor looked up sharply. What do you mean? Dr. Foster activated a new display, this one showing archaeological data from several different worlds. Over the past 20 years, we've made contact with survivors from 3 other species that faced devourer attacks. The Corvani thought to be extinct for 3 million years, but they're still alive, hiding in deep ocean trenches on their homeworld. The ethereal collective lost 95% of their population to the devourers about 8,000 years ago. Impossible, Professor Zeltak breathed. The Corvani are one of the oldest documented civilizations. If they were nearly extinct, how did they rebuild? They didn't rebuild, Commander Rodriguez said bluntly. That's the point. They learned to hide just like we did. They abandoned their surface cities and their space technology and went underground. They've been living in concealed settlements for millions of years. Captain Chen leaned back in her chair. The pattern is always the same. The devourers appear without warning, consume the majority of a civilization, then move on. The survivors learn to live without the technology signatures that attracted the attack in the first place. Professor Zeltak felt his worldview continuing to crumble. But the archaeological record shows continuous technological development across most species. How is it possible that so many civilizations have been reduced to hiding? Because the survivors don't appear in the archaeological record, Jake said simply. They're too busy staying hidden to leave traces for future archaeologists to find. Meanwhile, younger species develop and expand until they catch the devourer's attention. And the cycle repeats. Dr. Foster brought up another display, this one showing energy signatures from across the galaxy. We think the devourers are attracted to specific technological development patterns. Large-scale energy production, massive industrial complexes, certain types of FTL communication systems. Once a civilization reaches a certain threshold of detectable activity, it gets marked for consumption. Like cosmic predators, Professor Zeltak murmured. They hunt civilizations that grow too large or too advanced. That's our working theory, Commander Rodriguez agreed. Which means that species like yours, Professor, are potential targets. The Vorthian Empire spans hundreds of systems, uses massive fusion reactors, maintains constant interstellar communication networks. By our analysis, you're exactly the kind of civilization the devourers prefer to attack. The silence that followed this statement was heavy with implication. Professor Zeltak realized that Jake's testimony hadn't just been the story of humanity's near extinction. It had been a warning. What can we do? He asked quietly. Jake stood up, and for the first time since Professor Zeltak had met him, the young human smiled. We survive, Professor, and we help each other survive. That's what we've learned in 50 years of hiding. The galaxy is bigger than any one threat, even the devourers. Life finds a way, even when that way means starting over from scratch. He gestured around the room at the other human representatives. We're proof that extinction isn't inevitable, even against impossible odds. We've lost 99% of our people, but we're still here. Still growing, still hoping. Professor Zelthak looked around at the faces of the survivors. Professor Zelthak had not slept properly in 2 weeks. His 6 arms moved constantly across multiple data terminals, cross-referencing archaeological records, classified military reports, and the growing collection of survivor testimonies that Jake Miller had helped him compile. The academics' quarters at Galactic University had become a command center of sorts, with holographic displays showing star charts, energy signature analyses, and historical data stretching back millions of years. The more he researched, the more disturbed he became. The pattern was there, hidden in plain sight across galactic history. Advanced civilizations that reached certain technological thresholds simply vanished. The official records attributed these disappearances to various causes: natural disasters, civil wars, voluntary migrations to distant galaxies. But when viewed through the lens of Jake's testimony, a different story emerged. "Professor," came Jake's voice through the communication system. "I'm at the spaceport. Are you ready for this?" Zeltak gathered his research materials with trembling arms. 3 days ago, his analysis had identified a world that might hold answers. Corvash Prime, the former homeworld of the Corvani civilization. Official records stated that the planet had been abandoned after a series of catastrophic volcanic eruptions 3 million years ago. But energy signature analysis suggested something else entirely. The journey to Corvash Prime took 18 hours aboard Jake's modified transport. During the trip, Professor Zeltak shared his findings with the human and 2 other passengers, Dr. Elena Martinez, a human archaeologist from the Indara colony, and Captain Barry Scott, who commanded one of the smaller Void Fleet vessels. "The energy depletion patterns don't match volcanic activity," Zeltak explained as they reviewed the data. "The geological surveys show signs of systematic molecular extraction, similar to what you described happening to Earth." Dr. Martinez, a woman in her 40s with sharp blue eyes and scarred hands from years of careful excavation work, studied the planetary scans. If the Corvani faced a devourer attack 3 million years ago, there might be surviving records. The Corvani were known for building deep underground archives. "Assuming any Corvani actually survived," Captain Scott added. He was a practical man in his 30s, with the cautious demeanor of someone who had spent years avoiding detection. Dr. Foster mentioned contact with Corvani survivors, but we've never verified that independently. Jake piloted their ship through the asteroid field that surrounded Corvash Prime. The planet itself was a brown and gray sphere, its surface showing the scars of massive excavation. From orbit, they could see geometric patterns carved into the continents, too regular to be natural formations. "Devourer feeding patterns," Dr. Martinez breathed. "I've seen similar markings in the ruins of human colonies. They landed near what had once been the Corvani capital city. The surface was a wasteland of crystalline rubble and exposed bedrock, but Professor Zelthak's sensors detected artificial structures deep underground. The descent into the underground ruins took most of the day. Using mining equipment borrowed from the Kepler 442b colony, they cut through layers of collapsed stone and metal until they reached what appeared to be a massive archive complex. The Corvani had built their record-keeping facilities deep beneath their cities, carved directly into the planet's bedrock. "The preservation is remarkable," Dr. Martinez said as they entered the first chamber. The walls were covered in crystalline formations that pulsed with faint bioluminescent patterns. Corvani data storage technology was based on living crystal matrices. Even after 3 million years, some of these might still be functional. Professor Zelthak approached one of the larger crystal formations and activated his translation equipment. Slowly, patterns of light began to play across the crystal's surface, and ancient Corvani script appeared in the air above it. "Warning to those who come after," the translation read. "The harvesters have come to our world. We record this final testimony before retreating to the deep places. Let others learn from our failure." Jake stepped closer to the crystal. "Harvesters. That's what the Corvani called them." More crystals activated as they moved through the chamber, each one adding to the story. The Corvani records painted a picture eerily similar to humanity's experience. An advanced civilization that had expanded across multiple star systems, suddenly faced with incomprehensible entities that consumed entire worlds. Listen to this. Dr. Martinez called from across the chamber. She had found a crystal that showed tactical data. The Corvani military analysis of harvester capabilities. They identified the same energy signature tracking that the human survivors discovered. Professor Zeltak studied the tactical displays with growing excitement. This is invaluable intelligence. Combat reports, technical analyses, strategic assessments. The Corvani fought the Devourers for almost a year before their final retreat. Captain Scott was examining a different section of crystals. They documented harvester weaknesses too. Look at this. Electromagnetic interference patterns that could mask energy signatures, frequency modulations that seemed to confuse their tracking systems. As they worked deeper into the archive, the scope of the Corvani records became clear. This wasn't just a record of their own encounter with the Devourers. It was a compilation of data about similar attacks across galactic history. They knew, Jake said quietly as he read through the ancient files. The Corvani knew about the cycle. They had records of harvester attacks going back tens of millions of years. Dr. Martinez found the crown jewel of the archive, a massive crystalline formation at the heart of the complex that contained what appeared to be a comprehensive database of devourer encounters. Species after species, all following the same pattern. Rapid technological development, expansion across multiple systems, then sudden appearance of the harvesters followed by near-total extinction. According to this, Professor Zeltak said, his voice hushed with awe, the Devourers aren't random predators. They're part of a systematic process. They appear approximately every 50,000 to 100,000 years and target any civilization that has exceeded specific technological thresholds. Galactic population control, Captain Scott muttered. They're keeping intelligent life from getting too advanced. Jake was studying a tactical crystal that showed harvester technology in detail. The Corvani figured out that the Devourers weren't just consuming matter for energy. They were collecting it, storing it, building something with it. Dr. Martinez joined him at the display. Building what? Unknown, Jake read from the ancient record. But the Corvani believed that the harvesters were serving some larger purpose. Each attack seemed coordinated with others across the galaxy, as if the individual harvester units were part of a vast connected intelligence. Professor Zeltak was reviewing the chronological data when his communication device began chirping urgently. He activated it with one of his free arms and Captain Nina Chen's voice filled the chamber. Professor, we're detecting massive energy signatures entering the Corvash system. Long-range sensors show geometric patterns that match Devourer vessel configurations. You need to leave that planet immediately. The blood drained from Professor Zeltak's faces. How long do we have? At current approach speed, maybe 6 hours before they reach planetary orbit. Jake was already moving toward the exit. We can download as much data as possible and get out of here. Wait, Dr. Martinez called. She was standing before a crystal formation that had suddenly begun pulsing with bright blue light. This one is different. It's not a record, it's active. The crystal projected a holographic figure, a tall crystalline being that could only be a Corvani. The figure spoke in the ancient language, but Professor Zeltak's translator rendered the words in real time. If you are seeing this message, it means the harvesters have returned to our world. Do not despair. We have survived in the deep places for 3 million years, and we have learned much. The time of hiding may be ending. We have found others who resist the cycle. The hologram gestured and new data filled the air around them. Star charts showing hidden colonies, communication frequencies, and most importantly, coordinates for a meeting point in a distant system. Come to the Nexus if you seek to join the resistance. It is time to show the harvesters that their prey has learned to bite back. The message ended and the crystal went dark. In the silence that followed, Professor Zeltak realized that everything had changed. This wasn't just about documenting the near extinction of humanity anymore. This was about discovering that the galaxy's survivors were finally ready to fight back. Professor, Captain Chen's voice crackled through the communication system. Devourer vessels are accelerating. You have maybe 4 hours now. Jake grabbed as many data crystals as he could carry. Time to go. But first, we need to send a message to all the human colonies. What message? Dr. Martinez asked as they ran toward the surface. That we're not alone, Jake replied, and that the age of hiding might be coming to an end. As their ship lifted off from Corvash Prime, Professor Zeltak looked back at the ancient world where the Corvani had made their last stand 3 million years ago. Somewhere deep beneath that scarred surface, the descendants of that ancient civilization were still alive, still waiting, still. The message spread across the galaxy like wildfire, carried by whispered voices. From the underground cities of Kepler 442b to the nomadic fleets drifting between dead stars, humanity received the same coded transmission. The Nexus calls. The time of hiding ends. Come if you can fight. Professor Zelthak had never seen anything like the gathering that assembled in the Veil Nebula. Over the following weeks, ships appeared from the cosmic darkness, human vessels disguised as debris, Corvani deep space habitats that looked like asteroids, and stranger craft that belonged to species the galaxy had believed extinct for millions of years. Jake stood on the bridge of the Wanderer, now serving as a coordination vessel for the largest gathering of survivors in galactic history. Through the viewports, he could see dozens of ships maintaining careful formation within the nebula's concealing gases. Final count is in, reported Commander Rodriguez from her position at the communications station. 47 human vessels representing about 60,000 people. 12 Corvani deep habitat ships with unknown population counts. 6 vessels from the Ethereal Collective and, she paused consulting her display, 3 ships from species we've never encountered before. Dr. Foster, who had arrived from Indara aboard a bioship that looked more like a giant tree than a spacecraft, shook his head in amazement. In 50 years of hiding, we never imagined there were this many survivors. Professor Zelthak studied the tactical displays with 4 of his 6 arms while the other 2 worked on translation protocols. The diversity of technologies represented in the assembled fleet was staggering. Each species had developed its own approach to avoiding detection, resulting in vessels that seemed to violate known principles of engineering and physics. The Corvani ship configurations are fascinating, he murmured to Jake. They've essentially grown their habitats rather than building them. Living rock formations that can exist in space indefinitely, with minimal energy requirements. Captain Chen appeared on the main screen from her position aboard the Void Fleet flagship. Whatever we're planning to do, we need to do it soon. Long-range sensors are detecting Devourer movement toward this sector. They seem to be investigating the Corvash system. A new voice joined the conversation, speaking in crystalline harmonics that Professor Zelthak's translator struggled to render. We are Kethvar of the Deep Current. Our people have waited 3.7 million years for this gathering. The Harvest Lords grow complacent in their cycles. The speaker was a Corvani, but unlike any the professor had expected. Where archaeological records showed them as roughly humanoid beings of living stone, this individual appeared to be a shifting geometric pattern of crystal and light. Millions of years in hiding had changed them in ways that seemed almost mystical. Kethvar speaks truth, came another voice, this one belonging to one of the unknown species. The being that appeared on screen looked like a collection of floating metallic spheres that spoke in harmonic resonances. We are the remnant of the builders. Our creators fell to the harvesters 68 million years ago. We have studied. We have prepared. We have waited. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. These beings had been hiding and preparing for longer than complex life had existed on Earth. Dr. Martinez, who had been analyzing the data collected from Corvash Prime, looked up from her workstation. I think I understand what's happening here. The Devourers operate on a galactic cycle, returning to harvest advanced civilizations periodically, but they've never faced coordinated resistance from multiple survivor populations. Because the survivors have never been able to communicate before, Commander Rodriguez added, each species developed its own hiding methods in isolation. Professor Zelthak activated the main display, showing a composite map of the galaxy with marker positions for all known survivor populations. According to the data we've compiled, there are at least 12 different species with hidden populations scattered across hundreds of systems. Together you represent millions of individuals. Millions, Jake repeated softly. Still a tiny fraction of what we once were, but more than any of us knew existed. Captain Scott's voice came through from his position with the perimeter scouts. Contact. Devourer vessels have entered the outer edge of the nebula. Estimated arrival at our position in 6 hours. The mood in the fleet changed instantly. For weeks they had been planning and preparing, but now the moment of truth had arrived. Jake could feel the tension radiating from every ship in the formation. All vessels assume defensive positions, Commander Rodriguez ordered. Remember, we're not trying to destroy them. We're trying to prove that their prey has evolved. What followed was unlike any battle in recorded galactic history. The Devourers arrived as they always did, massive geometric structures that seemed to absorb light and energy, moving with the inexorable certainty of cosmic forces. They expected to find scattered survivors hiding in the nebula's depths. Instead, they found something unprecedented, a coordinated defense. The Corvani ships, with their living crystal hulls, proved nearly invisible to Devourer sensors. They served as scouts and intelligence gatherers, mapping the enemy formations and identifying weak points. The Ethereal Collective, beings of pure energy who had learned to inhabit specially designed containment vessels, acted as electronic warfare specialists. They flooded the space around the Devourers with interference patterns that disrupted their coordination systems. The Builder remnants deployed weapons that seemed to work on principles the Devourers couldn't counter, devices that turned the enemy's own molecular absorption capabilities against them, and the humans, who had spent 50 years learning to hide and survive, served as the backbone of the operation. Their ships, modified and adapted over decades of guerrilla warfare, struck fast and faded back into the nebula's concealing embrace. But the real weapon wasn't any technology. It was something the Devourers had never encountered in their millions of years of harvesting: cooperation between species that refused to die. "They're adapting," Jake observed as he watched the tactical displays. "The Devourers are trying to modify their approach, but they can't process what they're seeing." Professor Zelthak was monitoring the enemy communication frequencies with his translation equipment. "Their coordination patterns are becoming erratic. I think they're designed to handle individual species in isolation, not coordinated multi-species resistance." The battle raged for hours, but it wasn't the kind of desperate last stand that had characterized previous encounters with the Devourers. This was a controlled engagement, designed not to win a traditional victory but to send a message. "All vessels, begin withdrawal sequence," Commander Rodriguez ordered when the tactical objectives had been met. "We've done what we came here to do." As the survivor fleet faded back into the depths of space, leaving the Devourer formation damaged and confused, Jake realized what they had accomplished. For the first time in galactic history, a Devourer harvest operation had been forced to retreat. "They'll be back," Captain Chen said during the post-battle briefing, "probably in greater numbers." "Yes," Kethvar agreed, the Corvani's crystal form pulsing with what might have been satisfaction. "But when they return, they will find the galaxy changed. The age of easy harvests is ending." Dr. Foster brought up the long-range communication displays. "Every hidden population in the galaxy will know what happened here within a few months. The word will spread." Professor Zelthak looked around at the representatives of species that had been written off as extinct, beings who had spent millions of years in hiding, waiting for this moment. "What happens now?" he asked. Jake smiled, and for the first time since Professor Zelthak had met him, it was an expression of pure hope rather than grim determination. "Now we prove that extinction isn't inevitable," Jake said. "We show the galaxy that life doesn't just survive, it fights back. We teach other species that they don't have to hide forever." He gestured toward the tactical display that still showed the retreating Devourer formations. 99% of humanity is gone, Professor. But that last 1%? We're going to make sure it counts." As the various fleets dispersed back to their hidden bases and secret colonies, Professor Zelthak realized that he had witnessed the beginning of a new age. The Devourers had ruled the galaxy through fear and isolation for millions of years, but their prey had finally learned to work together, and extinction, as he had once believed, truly was rare, even when facing forces that seemed unstoppable. Life, it seemed, would always find a way to surprise those who underestimated its determination to survive. The galaxy would never be the same again. And perhaps, Professor Zelthak thought as he began composing his new lecture notes, that was exactly what it needed.